Thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I'm David Pendergrass. The other day, someone reached out to me on Twitter and asked me about a video that he had seen and asked what I thought about it. And I clicked on it, and the name of the video, you can find this on YouTube, is How to Remain a Christian. How to Remain a Christian. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And it's not what I thought. Of course, it's sarcasm. It's satire by an atheist young woman who gives, I don't remember now, 6, 7, 8 reasons, quote unquote, how to remain a Christian. And it's very sarcastic and condescending and very typical atheist. I didn't want to respond to it. I didn't want to respond to it because really I feel like it's such a waste of time on multiple levels. One is because atheists, in my experience, particularly the internet atheists, really don't give a rip about listening to arguments for. It's kind of like arguing with people who believe the earth is flat. Yeah, not every one of them, not all atheists are the same. I'm just saying in my experience, I don't think it makes a lot of difference to join that debate. The other reason it's a waste of time is a waste of my time. The things she says in this video, which I'm going to respond to, and that's what I'll do the podcast. Obviously I'm recording this, so I decided to do it. But the second reason I didn't want to do it is because it is a waste of my time. These arguments are so silly. They're so profoundly ill-informed. I guess the best word is dumb. They're asinine. They're inane, it's pablum, it's nonsense, and so it's difficult to respond to because I feel like it's such a waste of time. Having said that, it dawned on me there are a lot of Christians out there, and perhaps some skeptics and atheists who might listen to this podcast and go, I was always struggling with that, and I didn't know what to say in response. And to those people, I say, amen, and that's exactly why I'm doing the podcast. So if you find yourself like this gentleman on the Twitter who had questions, if he finds this material challenging, at one time I think he said she sounds very confident, and that's one of the problems, of course, right, is when a person sounds confident, it makes you wonder if therefore they're right, and maybe you're missing something. Well, she's confidently wrong. She's confidently mistaken. The thing she says is not compelling whatsoever. Okay, not to me it's not, and I'll tell you exactly why I think it's not compelling in the podcast. So this is not to convert an atheist, perhaps, because I doubt anyone's going to listen to it. She probably won't either, but this podcast is intended for if you're the average Christian who is not a specialist and you hear these things on YouTube or watch them and whatnot, and it might sound challenging to you. But before I tell you some of my final reflections at the very end of the podcast, let me say right off the bat, in case you don't listen to the whole thing, I really encourage you, don't listen to this nonsense. Please don't listen to nonsense on YouTube and think that just because it's on YouTube or just because they throw out some figures or facts, therefore that's scholarship. If you want to read about Christianity, if you want to read about any religion, read from the scholars themselves. Please do that. This kind of stuff is so, I'm trying to think of nice ways to say it. It's so silly. I just really encourage you, if you want books to read on different topics, and I'm going to say this on the podcast, I'm going to recommend things, but there's all kinds of good research out there, and they're not found by people who looked up Wikipedia and watched some YouTube videos and then made their own. But nevertheless, I'm going to do the usual thing. I'm going to play some of her video, and then I'm going to respond to each one, not thoroughly, but enough to make some kind of rejoinder. God bless. I hope you like it. Here she goes.
Hello YouTube, and welcome to Atheist Minority. If you're a Christian, you're convinced that I'm going to burn in hell because I'm an atheist. And I understand that's a frightening prospect for you. So since I know you don't want to be joining me in that handbasket, I've got a few tips for you that will help you remain secure in your Christianity.
So of course, right off the bat, this is not some even-headed scholarship issue. This is based on condescension and arrogance and pompousness. And I know it's funny to make fun of hell, and it's funny to make fun of people who think they're afraid of that. But of course, if she partially grasped what hell is like, then it would be a very frightening thought for her as well. But nevertheless, hopefully she doesn't go there. Hopefully she repents of her sins and puts her faith in Jesus. But nevertheless, right now, it doesn't look positive for her. We'll see what she says.
Now, I'm going to try to keep this short, but I have a lot of ground to cover, so just bear with me. Tip number 6. Don't compare any ancient religious practices to yours. Ancient Sumerians thrived around 5000 BC. They are the inventors of writing. They have clay tablets which tell the story of creating men from clay, creating woman from man's rib, the story of Cain and Abel, the gardens of Eden, the tree of knowledge, Noah and the flood, the story of Moses getting sent down the river, and many more.
You need to understand at this point, on the screen she's showing all kinds of images like Sargon equals Moses and things like that. This is where, unfortunately, having degrees in the field will help her not say such uninformed things. It is true that other ancient people groups wrote about similar concepts, sometimes speaking of their characters in similar ways. It is not true that there are parallel stories all the time in all the ancient literature. It is not true that you can take one character and say it equals so-and-so. That's false. She needs evidence to support the claim. Wikipedia or other YouTube video people aren't enough to count in scholarship. You need evidence to support that these characters are parallel to other characters. Secondly, even if the characters are similar to other characters, it does not mean that one is caused by the other. She's committing a typical logical fallacy, a paralogism called post hoc ergo propter hoc. That is, after this, therefore because of this. Just because something happens after the fact of something else, if B happens after A, it does not mean that B was caused by A. So it is irrelevant if something comes earlier. To demonstrate causation, you need very specific things to demonstrate causation, and that depends on a particular scholar or a particular field. But you usually need many, many words, many themes to be exactly paralleled for most scholars to believe that there is causation involved. You cannot say if something's earlier, therefore it was caused by that. A third thing I would say is oral tradition antedates or predates the written word. It is irrelevant to date ancient literature and compare it to the written time or chronology, the supposed written chronology of the Bible. What matters is the oral tradition that is contained in the writing. And this is where it is extremely difficult to tell in scholarship. We study this kind of stuff, and we try to make determinations, and it's very much debated all the time, exactly when stories were written. And there are certain ways that are telltale signs, such as the way the Hebrew is formed, the way the stories demonstrate particular locales, all kinds of signs inside of it. The written word is not nearly as important as the oral tradition that is being written down. So just because something was written down before the Bible doesn't mean it is before the Bible. But again, even if it is before it, it doesn't mean it's caused by it. If you want to know more about this subject, and I encourage you to, because scholars study this all the time, there are two books I recommend to you. Two books. One book is called Old Testament Parallels. Old Testament Parallels, Laws and Stories from the Ancient Near East by Victor Matthews. Old Testament Parallels by Victor Matthews. It has an enormous amount of, it's revised and expanded third edition. It's a short read, but it's got a lot of different stories that sound similar to various stories in the Old Testament. Another book that's very good, and I recommend even more, is by an Old Testament specialist named John Walton. The book is entitled Ancient Near Eastern Thought and the Old Testament, Introducing the Conceptual World of the Hebrew Bible. Ancient Near Eastern Thought and the Old Testament, Introducing the Conceptual World of the Hebrew Bible by John Walton. He introduces all kinds of themes that are found in the ancient world, and he compares and contrasts that to the Old Testament. I have no idea why Old Testament parallels, so-called, help a person remain a Christian or stop remaining Christian. Of course, the point is, by irony, she's saying you can remain a Christian if you do not study the ancient conceptual world or the ancient civilizations that had similarities to the Old Testament. How in the world does that make me not a Christian if I study ancient concepts and the ancient world? How in the world does that make me... Why should I abandon Christianity if there are stories in the ancient world that are similar to Moses or similar to Noah? How could that conceivably mean Jesus did not rise from the dead? This is irrelevant. It's completely irrelevant. Moreover, as I've just stated, scholars study this. We're forced to study and read all this junk in our PhD. So how is it that hundreds of thousands of Christians throughout history have remained Christians and yet are specialists? Brilliant men and women who read a dozen languages in Akkadian, Sumerian, and whatever, and they just happen to stay Christian? Are they just so stupid and don't see it? Or is it because it's conceivable to be a Christian and know the ancient context? Of course, it's the latter, not the former. She continues,
Do you think it's just a coincidence that some of these same biblical stories were told thousands of years before the Bible was written? Hammurabi's code from ancient Babylonia came hundreds of years before the Ten Commandments, and they were more complete and evolved. Of the Ten Commandments, only 4 of them are really relevant or have any significance.
again here, I think she thinks that if something sounds like the Old Testament, it therefore means that it's not from God. Maybe that's the assumption. I can't tell what her assumption is because she doesn't say it. It's so thick in sarcasm, I'm not sure what her point is. She's not making an argument. She's just mentioning things I think she thinks are shocking to a Christian, and maybe for some people it is. But yes, in the Old Testament, there are biblical themes and characters that sound like other characters in the ancient world. Not all of them, but several of them. So what? You can't date something and say because it's earlier. First off, you got to demonstrate it's earlier. Secondly, because it's earlier doesn't mean it's caused for the latter. And third is still the so what question. It doesn't mean for a second that if something sounds like something else, it's not authoritative. And even if it is something very similar to another culture, what does this have to do with being a Christian? Hammurabi's code has nothing to do with being a Christian. Just because it's earlier, just because of the fuller treatment. When someone says at the very end also, when she says, and it's also more exhaustive, only 4 things in the Ten Commandments even matter in significance, well, to her, but of course she's an atheist. The other commandments are about how God sets up a theocracy, a government ruled by God's reign. And so keeping the Sabbath and keeping it holy and not defaming his name, these are crucial concepts when you're setting up a theocracy. Of course she doesn't care. She's an atheist. So to her, they're irrelevant, and she may like the Babylonian code more. Okay, well, that's her opinion. That's irrelevant to being a Christian. This is completely irrelevant.
And Hammurabi covered them all, plus more. One of the most interesting things to note is that Hammurabi's code actually had women's rights written into the law. So the Ten Commandments aren't unique by any stretch of the imagination.
If she thinks that Hammurabi's code has women's rights that are somewhat equivalent to the modern feminist rights, she needs to get a degree in that field to make that kind of profound, earth-shattering argument, because I have never in my life heard of such nonsense. Hammurabi's code has some privileges for women. Sure it does. So does the Israeli code in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. They are very much a patriarchal society in both societies. Yeah, they have some distinctions. I think a lot of things. I'm trying to be fair. I just don't know what she knows, but based on this video, because it seems so ignorant, I need to instruct you if you think the same thing. If you think the Ten Commandments are unique, well, it's true and it's false. It's true in that some of them seem to be, and that, for example, no ancient culture called for the worship of only one God. In just a second, she's going to quote from Egypt, and she's wrong again, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the point of the Ten Commandments that most Old Testament specialists would argue is not that this is, as she says, the Hammurabi Code is, quote, more complete. The Decalogue of the Ten Commandments is not intended to be a complete constitution for the Israeli people. It is not. Commandments were not used like that. It's much more like demonstrating who's in control. It's almost like an American flag. So it gives baseline skeleton, but that's not the point. Actual Jewish jurisprudence, or I don't know if that's the right word, my lawyer friends might correct me on that. The actual legal code, the unpacking of what these how to use these constitution and real world, that's unpacked in Exodus, Deuteronomy, Leviticus. It's unpacked in these areas. The Ten Commandments are not intended to be comprehensive. So I just don't understand her point at all if she has one. If she thinks you can't be a Christian if the Ten Commandments sound like other ancient law codes, that's just silly nonsense. Everybody knows, in the field, in scholars, everybody knows that those codes sound like other codes. You can be a Christian and not think the Ten Commandments are completely unique. Besides the fact that there are aspects of them that are completely unique. Ancient people didn't have a Sabbath or Shabbat. Other people didn't worship only one God or demand the only worship of one God. Nevertheless, I'm trying my best to understand the point. I don't get it. And then she goes on about Egypt here in just a second. Here she goes.
And what about monotheism? It actually comes from Egypt, centuries before Judaism. Research the pharaoh Akhenaten and the Egyptian sun god Aten, the universal God who stretched his sun rays across all of creation, blessing everyone, not just a single chosen tribe. This idea of worshiping only one God was revolutionary at the time. But it doesn't originate with the Bible. It originates with the ancient Egyptians. I've been to Egypt. I've seen the hieroglyphics on ancient temple walls with my very own eyes.
That last part really cracked me up. Come on now, sister. Okay, I've been to Egypt too. I've seen the hieroglyphics too on the wall. I can't read them no more than you can read them. But you're mistaken. You do need to research. Anybody can research the pharaoh she's talking about. It was revolutionary. It was so revolutionary, it was an abject failure. For a very, very short period of time, the Pharaoh of Egypt, Akhenaten, he mandated the primary worship of the sun god. And it went off like oil and water. They hated it. As soon as he died, they basically, you might say, vetoed or demolished all of his ideas and went back to their polytheism. Even Egyptologists disagree on whether or not we should understand that as monotheism. In my research, the average view is that it is not monotheism. It was instead henotheism. Henotheism is the belief that there is one chief god and then there are a bunch of other minor gods. So what was revolutionary for that very, very, very small slice of pie in time at Egypt, at minimum, and probably at maximum, was this Pharaoh said, hey, let's all focus most of our energy on the sun god and diminish how much we have festivals to these other gods. And he made them do it. And when he died, they went back to the way it used to be. They hated it. So that is not the origin of monotheism. It's not the origin of monotheism. Even if it was the origin of monotheism, it was an abject failure for the Egyptians. How does this in any way at all affect whether or not I remain a Christian? This doesn't make any sense. No matter what your view is of the Egyptian attempt at henotheism and perhaps at monotheism, it does not take away the fact that the ancient Jews were the only race in the world and out all of history that claimed that there was absolutely one God to be worshipped. Now, it's true that ancient Israelites probably were henotheistic by practice. By practice, that is to say, the average, I'll say this loosely, the average Jew, if you could time travel back to the time of Abraham and, well, past him, but certainly the time of Moses, the average Jew, how many gods are there? They'd probably say, well, there's one God we worship, but there are a bunch of little g gods. And the prophets had to beat this in their heads over and over and over. So do the religious leaders. So it's not true probably that all the Jews thought there really was only one God, but it is true that at some point, at least by the Babylonian exile, that they started arguing very much so that not only is there one God just to be worshipped, there is only one God. But in practice, to worship only one God very much leans toward monotheism. That's a long discussion, long debate. So whatever your view is of Egypt's view of that small few years of time where they worship the sun god chiefly, it is irrelevant to whether or not I remain a Christian. It's irrelevant whether or not the Jews got it right. You could just as easily argue, and they were right to be monotheistic. The sun god's not the real God, but at least they were onto something. You could argue that way if you wanted. It's irrelevant to Christianity. And I'm glad she's been to Egypt. That's wonderful.
Then what about Christian holidays? Easter and Christmas actually have pagan origins. Have you ever wondered what Easter eggs and Christmas trees have to do with Jesus Christ? You're absolutely right. Nothing. They're leftover symbols from the pagan festivals which are the root of these holidays. Ancient people had Christmas trees before Jesus Christ was even born. Check your Bible. I'll even give you the verse.
What in the world do Christmas trees and Easter bunnies have to do with whether or not I stay a Christian? I can't believe it. And the video gets no better than this. It is irrelevant why Americans use the Christmas tree the way they do, or certain Western cultures. Not everyone in the world does. Pick on something else. Whoever said Christmas trees were integral to the Christmas story? They're not even in Matthew or Luke, anywhere in the New Testament. Who said that the Easter bunny is ever related to Jesus? Nobody does. That's pagan influence. So you're right. It has pagan influence, pagan origins. That's exactly right. It's pagan origin. In fact, in my own family, that's why we don't have Easter Bunny stuff. We don't celebrate Santa or Elf on the Shelf, because it's not about Jesus. The Christmas tree was used for a long time, yep, but what Christians do today is not because they celebrate a tree. They don't worship a tree. They use it as a demonstration of everlasting life. It's the green. It's the evergreen. But even if that's what Christians do. If you're pagan, who cares what it is? Who cares what your view is? Because you're not celebrating what a Christian's view of Christmas is. And then the Christmas tree song, the tune she plays, she quotes from Jeremiah chapter 10 to the 4. And for some reason, she quotes it from the King James Version. I have no idea why. But here is what she quotes, Jeremiah 10, 2 to 4. Well, I'm not even going to quote it. She quotes from the King James Version. Here's a better translation from the NET. She quotes verses 2, 3, and 4, so 3 verses, in a context where Jeremiah is speaking on behalf of Yahweh to the people of Israel. And he's speaking to them because those various gods nearby, they're nearby people groups, as it were, you might say, particularly Babylon and the Canaanite religions, they would go to all kinds of measures. All ancient people did. The Egyptians did. Everybody but the Jews made idols. An idol was not a metaphor. It was a thing. They typically were made of wood. They would carve it out of wood. Where does wood come from? Wood comes from a tree. Newsflash, I know. I'm very, very smart. It comes from a tree. Sometimes it came from stone. Sometimes clay. They would form images of their gods. It was very common. The word is idol, and that's one of the number one sins of the ancient Jews, and Jews to this day, and of the Christians, by the way, is idolatry. Idolatry. When Jews get around these people, they would think these idols had power. They really thought the idols represented the gods. It happened even all the way to the New Testament. In fact, it's in Revelation. And in context of Jeremiah 10, he addresses these idols they make. Here's exactly what it says in Jeremiah. Now, you tell me, listener of the podcast, if this is about a Christmas tree. You tell me. Here's what it says. You people of Israel, listen to what the Lord has to say to you. The Lord says, do not start following pagan religious practices. Do not be in awe of signs that occur in the sky, even though the nations hold them in awe. For the religion of these people is worthless. They cut down a tree in the forest, and a craftsman makes it into an idol with his tools. He decorates it with overlays of silver and gold. He uses a hammer and nails to fasten it together, so that it will not fall over. Such idols are like scarecrows in a cucumber field. They cannot talk. They must be carried because they cannot walk. Don't be afraid of them, because they cannot hurt you, and they don't have any power to help you. I said, this is Jeremiah quote, there's no one like you, Lord. You are great, and you are renowned for your power. Everyone should revere you, O King of all nations, because you deserve to be revered. For there is no one like you among any of these wise people of the nations, nor among any of their kings. The people of those nations are both stupid and foolish. Instruction from a wooden idol is worthless. Listen, instruction from a wooden idol is worthless. Verse 9, hammered out silver is brought from Tarshish, and gold is brought from Uphaz to cover those idols. They are the handiwork of carpenters and goldsmiths. They are clothed in blue and purple clothes. They are all made by skillful worker. The Lord is the only true God. He's a living God and the everlasting King. When he shows his anger, blah, 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 blah. Is that a Christmas tree? Is that a Christmas tree? How many people do you know have ever gone out, cut down a Christmas tree, decorated it in fine linen and put gold on it, shaped it into an idol, and thought that the tree started talking to him to represent a Canaanite god? I'm worked up because it's so dumb. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be worked up. I can't believe this. I can't believe this nonsense makes it to the world. I can't believe that the comments on the YouTube channel laud and praise her. You're the best ever. I'm so glad I found this channel. I can't wait to subscribe to you. This is the best thing I've ever heard in my whole life. You're so smart. I can't believe how dumb this is. What does that have to do with being a Christian or not? Or whether or not the Christmas tree is used? And what does Jeremiah have to do with the Christmas tree? Nothing is the answer. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. So look, can Christians celebrate with a Christmas tree? Of course they can. Should a Christian get a Christmas tree, decorate it, turn it into an idol for the Canaanite god Baal and worship it? No, they shouldn't do that. They shouldn't do that. So if you're tempted to do that, I wouldn't do it. That's pagan. Otherwise, who gives a rip? I could decorate my dog, my cat, a horse. I go out there and get my truck, put a big wrapping paper on it and a bow and put presents underneath it and call it a Christmas truck. What possible difference does this make? Okay. Okay, it gets better. Here she goes.
Tip number 5. Don't look for evidence to support Old Testament accounts.
Oh my Lord, atheists love the Old Testament. I'm still unclear how any of this has to do with how I can remain a Christian. You would think we'd start with Jesus or the resurrection if that's what we're talking about. But no, I guess that's too difficult. Let's stick with Noah and the flood, because all of my Christian faith rests on Noah and the flood or Jericho. But okay, I don't understand why the Old Testament infatuation is among atheists, but hear what she says.
There is no archaeological or historical evidence to prove the biblical account of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt or the 10 plagues. There is no historical evidence of a united monarchy. There's no geological evidence of a worldwide flood. There's no archaeological evidence for the conquest of Jericho. And there's no scientific evidence to support the Bible's creation account or the young earth hypothesis. Yet, there's irrefutable evidence of evolution and the Big Bang Theory, which dates our planet to about 4 billion years and our universe to approximately 14 billion years. It's practically undeniable now. So get on board, because the next thing that's going to happen is that Christians will start to proclaim that the Big Bang is how God created the universe.
The next thing we'll do? How about Genesis has been saying that for centuries? Though it's not called the Big Bang, the fact that it had a beginning from a nothing existence. That's a weird way to say it. I have to say it now because people like Krauss and others keep saying nothing is a something nonsense. Anyway, the fact that it came from a state of nothingness to somethingness. Call that Big Bang, Little Bang, Side Bang, whatever it is, that's Genesis. God created the heavens and the earth. Even if you don't want to read Genesis that way, that's fine, because it's all through the New Testament as well. And I don't have the time. You can read it up yourself. It's all through the New Testament, the belief that God created all things. It's a standard Jewish belief, no matter how you read Genesis 1 and 2. And back to the first part. If you want to read about archaeology, which is still very much in its nascency, because a lot in Israel and Egypt has not been dug up. It hasn't been dug up for various reasons. One is because it is a new field of study that's a fairly recent deal. I know they've been doing excavations here and there, but real scholars in the field and the specialists have not been on that long, and there aren't hundreds of thousands of archaeologists digging all the time. There's a lot of work to be done. Another major reason why archaeology is still in relative infancy is because a lot of it is covered up by sites that are considered sacred in Muslim areas and in Jewish areas. There's an enormous amount that's not been uncovered. It is always sketchy, dubious at best, to make conclusions about what did not happen based on what we have not discovered, no matter what it is. Now, if there is zero trace of something, and we've been studying a field for a long time, then it's more likely. But if something is still in its nascency, it's new, that's difficult. And so this is exactly why in scholarship, it's very much debated on how to understand the evidence and the data. So when she says there's no evidence for, I have no idea who she's reading for those conclusions. She might be reading the book that's real popular amongst atheists called The Bible Unearthed, Archaeology's New Vision of Ancient Israel and the Origin of its Sacred Text. The Bible Unearthed, and that's by Finkelstein and Silberman. And these two scholars are scholars, and they argue that archaeological evidence for them demonstrates that people like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob never existed, and David and Solomon were not kings, the Exodus never happened, on and on. That's the farthest one side you can go. If you read another side that's full of research and all kinds of things, is a book called Biblical Archaeology. Biblical Archaeology. It's in 2 volumes by David Graves. David Graves, Biblical Archaeology. Recent discoveries that support the reliability of the Bible. It's paperback, and I think it's a fun read. But if you want to read more about archaeology, read it. But even if we do not have archaeological evidence for the plagues, how in the world could you find such archaeological evidence for frogs dying and for locusts? How could you find archaeological evidence for that? Of course we don't have it. Even if we don't find archaeological evidence that's irrefutable about Exodus occurs and so forth, why in the world can I not remain a Christian? Just because I can't find in stone or inscription for these things does not mean it didn't occur. And if we don't have evidence for it, why in the world can't I still be a Christian? What does that have to do with anything? And what in the world does this have to do with evolution? I also concur that the universe is probably close to 14 billion years old. I think the Earth is about 6.5 billion years old, or however old it is, whatever. That's great. It's ancient. Wonderful. She thinks that Christians only hold to the idea that the Earth is a few thousand years old. There's a very small group of Christians who hold that view. That is not the orthodox standard classical view of the age of the Earth. Genesis and any other parts of the Bible are not a science textbook. They're not. We should not expect to read these texts and expect scientific explanations. It is irrelevant. If the Old Testament or New Testament doesn't talk about black holes and leptons and quarks, it's just irrelevant. So there is no challenge whatsoever to modern scientific discovery and whether or not it began. The universe began to exist. And that's what Jews and Christians have been asserting for thousands and thousands and thousands of years.
Number 4, don't research the origin of the Bible. The original transcripts don't exist. Even our oldest versions are still just a copy of a copy of a copy. Several books have been removed from the Bible, and plenty of passages have been added.
It's true, the original manuscripts don't exist. And everything else she said, what in the world is she talking about? What is she talking about? What evidence does she have that several books have been removed from the Bible and that passages have been added? She needs evidence for this. If she means books that don't make it into modern day Protestant Bibles, that's been known since the Protestants made the Protestant canon. What in the world is she talking about? She can't be talking about the Old Testament apocryphal books or the pseudepigrapha, because we study that all the time in scholarship in all the original languages. She can't be talking about the New Testament apocryphal works or pseudepigraphic works. Those are also studied. She can't be talking about the so-called apostolic period or the early church fathers, because those are studied. What books is she talking about that's so hidden that no one studies? And who cares if it's part of the original canon of the Bible? We study them. There's a reason why those books didn't make it. The early church for centuries did not think they should be included. And once you read them themselves, I think they're right. It's still irrelevant if other books are out there. If you want to add some books to your canon, your Bible collection, you don't want, the books in your, I don't know if you're a Catholic, Protestant, what if you listen to this, Orthodox. If you want to add some books, then go read them. What difference does that make? That can't be the reason not to become a Christian if you're an atheist. Well, there's some books my church won't let me read. Well, go read them. That's wonderful. What difference does that make? I can't believe she said it. And then some passages have been added. Yeah, they have. Probably so. Like John 7:53 through 8:11. The woman caught in adultery. Guess what? We know that. We know it doesn't show up to the 3rd and 4th century manuscripts. Not in the earliest manuscripts. They're in later manuscripts. Well, guess what? We know which ones are there. We know which ones were added later. Every other text we have, we know for a fact, are in the earliest documents. Earlier texts that go back to the 2nd century. So what? If these texts were added later, we know which ones they are. And there's only a couple of them. That's it. And the ones that were added later on, the King James Version, whatever, in modern translations, those were removed. So the only thing I agree with her is the very beginning, which is we don't have the originals and we have copies of copies. That's true. It is irrelevant if we have copies of copies. What matters is if the copies can be trusted to reproduce the original. And we can. If you want more about this, go listen to my podcast called Why I Think Christianity is True. Why I Think Christianity is True, particularly parts 3 and 4. Or go get a degree in textual criticism. There is very, very, very good reason to believe that the copies we have are overwhelmingly accurate. Go listen to my podcast. So it is irrelevant if they're copies. What matters if the copies can be trusted. She goes on.
Also, during biblical times, more than 90% of the population was completely illiterate. So the stories of the Bible began as an oral tradition. Have you ever played that game Telephone in school where the teacher starts with the first student and whispers something in his or her ear, and you're supposed to whisper what you heard to the person behind you, and so it goes all the way through the entire classroom until the very last person gets the message? Every single time, the last person who stands up and repeats what they heard in their ear is something that is vastly different from the original message that started with that first person. Now consider you had years and years of this going on before anyone ever wrote down the first Bible story. And when they finally did start writing the stories down and copying them, it was a human being manually transcribing from one document to another.
Here's what she should have said. Imagine someone tells a story and it's passed down to another person and another person, and the third person says, did I get this right? And goes back and talks to the original person and then makes corrections and then goes back and changes some more and then copies it and goes, I wonder if I got this right. Then the other person goes back and talks to the original. Her analogy is completely irrelevant and false. We have every reason to think that the early Gospels and letters of Paul were copied by going back to the original. Tertullian in the 2nd century, see, I talk about this in my podcast. Tertullian in the 2nd century says that the original documents in the 2nd century are still in the churches to whom they were written. He said, go look for them yourself, the originals. We have scholars who argue that manuscripts, papyrus manuscripts, if handled correctly, can last up to 200 years. There is every reason to think that the original documents, as handed on to the churches, that's what I mean by the ones that say the church at Corinth got, or whatever it is, that those originals were kept in high regard and seen as scripture very early on and retained and treasured. And people went back and copied from the original itself. There is no reason to assume her analogy is true. The evidence goes against it. There's a whole host of reasons I'm not going into right now. You can listen to my podcast or go do all your research yourself. There's no reason to think that it went on for copy after copy after copy, later, generation to generation. That old German model is not compelling much to most Western thinkers at all in scholarship. The last thing I'd say is this. It is commonly argued now that most of the gospel material comes from within the lifetime of the eyewitness. People like Richard Bach and many others have argued, and have been more and more arguing and more compelling, arguing that huge chunks of the data from the gospel material comes from eyewitnesses. You need to understand that in the ancient world, eyewitness testimony was valued more than copies. They valued what they call the living voice. The Roman historian Polybius, who writes around the same time the Gospels were composed, says this exact thing. If you want to write good history, you need to go talk to the people who were there. That Papias, who was the bishop of Hierapolis, and anyway, I'm going to bog down. Go listen to my podcast. They valued the living witness. It is highly likely that when the gospel authors wrote their material, they consulted eyewitness testimony themselves and or people who were there who knew firsthand the eyewitnesses themselves from churches where they went to church. Her analogy is completely false, misleading, and unconvincing.
And don't even get me started on the King James Version of the Bible, the one that everyone considers to be the authorized version. When they did the translation, they didn't even bother to go back to the oldest known copies of the manuscripts. They just translated from other modern versions at the time.
Well, I'm glad she didn't get started on the King James Version. I'm glad she didn't start or finish on it because it's irrelevant. No, most people don't think it's the authorized version. A handful of people think it's the authorized version. Most Christians around the world do not use the King James Version. In fact, of all English translations, it's considered one of the worst there is because it does not use the most primitive and ancient manuscripts. And who cares what the King James Version says? When you study the New Testament and the Old Testament, you read it from Greek and Hebrew with some Latin and some Aramaic. That's where you study it in scholarship. Who cares what the translation is? And even if you cannot read the original languages, and even if you do not read modern translations, but you just adore the King James Version, it's your favorite, who cares? Why can't I remain a Christian and use the King James Version? Well, of course I can. Of course I can remain a Christian and read from the King James Version. What does that have to do with anything that her YouTube is trying to dismiss?
Number 3, don't research Jesus Christ. If you do, you will find uncanny similarities between Jesus Christ and other pagan gods who predate Christianity. The virgin birth, the Son of God, God as man, the concept of the Holy Trinity, the wise men, beginning a ministry around the age of 30, performing miracles, the Last Supper, the crucifixion, the resurrection after 3 days, the apocalypse. These story elements are not unique to Jesus Christ, nor did they originate with Jesus Christ. It's stolen mythology.
This is more of that comparison parallel mania nonsense from the Old Testament. I can't believe this stuff is still going around. About 250 years ago, there were certain German scholars who were making the argument that it's all myth and it's all similarities. She needs to demonstrate evidence for this. You can't put just words on the screen as she does, Dionysius and Horus and whatever, and say it's all the same. The problem is she's got some heavy sledding to do because nobody in critical scholarship would concur with her. No one in the world that I know of who's well known at all in scholarship would say that she makes a compelling case. The reason why is because it's a myth. It's not borrowing myth to be like Jesus. It's a myth or a legend that it is borrowed from other places. When you quote from sources that were written down centuries after Jesus existed about characters that supposedly existed before Jesus, that's not compelling. In fact, it's much more compelling that those people who wrote about those stories that sound exactly like Jesus, written in Roman Empire, where there are major church centers, is that those people copy the character of Jesus. And Egyptian gods, Horus and all this stuff, have nothing to do with Jesus. So she needs to support evidence. You need evidence to demonstrate. And you can't say, see, someone dies, someone lives. It's just like Jesus. Nobody in the ancient world, no Greek, Roman, Latin, Egyptian, nobody believed that when someone died, they could come back to a physical life. And that's precisely what they believed Jesus did. No one believed they were walking around Messiah who had the authority to forgive sins, and on it goes. So it is complete YouTube fantasyland atheist nonsense pablum to continue to posit that Jesus is just stealing myths from other places.
And let's say Jesus Christ did exist. If so, he was just a Jewish man. He believed every word in the Old Testament was true, and he referred to it as the scriptures. His ministry involved going around and preaching from the scriptures. He also strongly believed that the apocalypse was going to occur during the current generation. He thought it was right around the corner, and he promised his disciples that he would return in their lifetime. That didn't happen now, did it?
Notice at the beginning when she said, if Jesus existed. I'm telling you, if you ever hear a person say, if Jesus existed, or especially they say he didn't exist, turn off the YouTube video. Change the channel. You're wasting your time with a crackpot. There are no historians in the world who are worth anything in scholarship who suggest that Jesus never existed. It's unbelievable asinine fatuity. And this other stuff about he promised the apocalypse would happen in his lifetime, no, he did not. You need evidence for that. You need to demonstrate where Jesus believed the apocalypse was going to happen in his lifetime. The last thing she said was he said that he will return before they die. You need to also demonstrate that. And we say it didn't happen, did it? Well, what didn't happen is he never said it. She quotes on the screen Matthew 16:28, where Jesus is talking about his being denying yourself, picking up your cross and following. He wants to save his life, will lose it. Verse 27, he says, for the Son of Man will come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will reward each person according to what he has done. I tell you the truth, there are some standing here who will not experience death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. There are numerous ways the church has interpreted that. Some, you might say, his return at the very end of time. That's possible. That's very possible. But there's no reason to say, it doesn't say apocalypse. Scholars do various things. Coming into his kingdom can be one, it can be the transfiguration itself, which immediately follows in the narrative. The very next thing is the transfiguration. 2, it could be his resurrection and ascension, which is exactly what happened. 3, the coming of the Spirit. 4, Christ's role in the church. 5, the destruction of Jerusalem. 6, Jesus' second coming and the establishment of the kingdom. I love how this one author says it. The reference to 6 days later in 17:1, that's the next one, seems to indicate that Matthew had the transfiguration in mind, insofar as it was a substantial prefiguring of the consummation of the kingdom. Now, this interpretation has its problems, but as such, the transfiguration would be a tremendous confirmation to the disciples that even though Jesus had just finished speaking of his death, he was nonetheless the promised Messiah and things were proceeding according to God's plan. So it is possible that he pictured his return within their lifetime. That is possible. I'm absolutely agreeing with that. It's also possible that's not what he's talking about. And if you're going to argue that's what it is, you need to argue that. Quoting a Bible verse does not settle it, not in scholarship, when there are multiple ways to interpret it, and there are viable options to interpret it. And even if that's what Jesus said, and he meant he's going to return at the end of time before they die, even if that's what's said, it would mean Matthew was wrong, or it meant Jesus was wrong. If Jesus was wrong about that, does that mean he wasn't raised from the dead? It would call into question whether or not he got everything right, sure. But you have to argue for that. You need to demonstrate that. And a person certainly could still be a Christian if this account was wrong about the end of time or about his return. You still could be a Christian. Though, again, I don't think it's problematic.
Jesus Christ was a prophet. He wasn't divine. Which brings me to point number 2. Don't learn about the Nicene Creed. When Christianity was still in its infancy, various factions believed many different things about Jesus Christ. Around 300 AD, Arianism was posing a real threat to Christianity. It embraced the whole idea that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, created by the Father and therefore a lesser being. Coincidentally, this idea was very similar to the Gnostics and the pagan teaching of the time, so something had to be done about it. In 325 AD, Roman Emperor Constantine called a council in Nicaea, and he invited all the bishops from the Christian churches. During this council, they got together and proclaimed that the Son was God. Then Emperor Constantine said any bishop who refused to sign off on this proclamation would be excommunicated and exiled. Believe it or not, the Holy Ghost wasn't proclaimed divine until the Second Council, which happened 56 years later. Thus, the concept of the Holy Trinity was born. This is clearly a man-made doctrine. I challenge you to find any place in the Bible where the divinity of Jesus Christ is explicitly stated. You won't find it. It has to be inferred from ambiguous verses.
Okay, praise God, this is almost done. This is a huge subject, and I guess like all of this, if you're not familiar with the field, I guess to say, trust me, I have a PhD in historical theology. I'm not boasting, blah, blah, blah. All I'm saying is I spent a lot of time reading in this exact field. There's about 2 things she got right. It is true that a creed was called. It's true that Constantine called this, and it is true that what's called Nicene Orthodoxy became the legal official stance of the Roman Empire. That's true. Everything else you said is wrong. There was no movement called Arianism. Arius was a little-known bishop, and he was quite inconsequential. And this is such a huge topic. Arianism was a name given by the proto-Orthodox camp against people who held a view like his. If you want to read all about Arius from a well-known patristic scholar, you need to read Arius, Heresy and Tradition, by the former Archbishop of Canterbury. His name is Rowan Williams. Rowan Williams, the book is called Arius, Heresy and Tradition. Then you'll learn what you need to learn about this. If you want to learn more about what really happened at Nicaea and not anything she said, because everything she said is wrong about the nuance and the details and the facts. It is false that they did not believe Jesus was divine until Nicaea, or the Spirit wasn't divine until the former creeds. That's absolute nonsense. If you want to go read, there are 3 books I would recommend you read. One is gargantuan, but nevertheless, if you really want to know what you're talking about, and not just follow people on YouTube who don't know what they're talking about, go read R.P.C. Hansen, The Search for the Christian Doctrine of God. The Search for the Christian Doctrine of God. You need to go read it. It's going to take you a little bit, but it's a great book. If you want a smaller book to read, there are 2 volumes that are really good. Really, really good, by John Behr. John Behr. Behr is B-E-H-R. B-E-H-R. The volume 1 is called The Way to Nicaea. The Formation of Christian Theology, Volume 1. Formation of Christian Theology, Volume 1, The Way to Nicaea. Volume 2 is called The Nicene Faith. Those are really good read, and it's nerdy and whatever. It will tell you exactly all the different doctrine developed. It's absolutely false that Jesus was just a dude until Nicaea. It is false. It is false that Arianism believed that Jesus was created like the Gnostics did. Arius and Sabellius and others argued that, as far as we can tell, we don't have a lot of their writings, we have people who oppose them, as far as we can tell, that they did believe Jesus was created before the foundation of the world. He was a creature, but he was a divine creature. Salvation was still through him. But he is not like any other creature, but he was created. And that comes from exegeting passages like Proverbs chapter 8. And that time period, this is a huge story, but just a synopsis. In that time period in the history of the church, Proverbs 8 was considered one of the most controversial chapters in all the Bible, because they were suggesting that the best way to understand Jesus was the Word. Of course, they originally got this from John chapter 1. The Word or God's wisdom were used interchangeably at this time period. So they went to Proverbs chapter 8, which talked about wisdom being created. Listen, the short of the story is, they did not ever debate whether or not, even Arius and Sabellius and all these other people who eventually became outsiders, they did not debate whether or not Jesus was God, God-kind. They debated the way to talk about the relationship between God the Father and Son. Everybody assumed he was divine. Everybody held to the authority of Scripture. They were trying to find the biblical ways to articulate their relationship. The exact same is true with the Spirit. The Spirit was never a dude or a creature or an it, and then one day they decided the Spirit was divine. They used several councils to try to articulate the way that the Spirit should be communicated when we speak about Father, Son, and Spirit. So when she says that this is clearly a human invention, of course it's a human invention. Of course it is. Humans were wrestling with how to articulate the way in which the Father, Son, and Spirit were related. Of course it is. I can very much still be a Christian and believe that humans developed this doctrine. Of course. You might think they're inspired to come to that conclusion. That's fine. Whatever. I can still be a Christian and think that humans and human minds tried to articulate the ways that we should speak about Father, Son, and Spirit. What does this have to do at all with remaining a Christian? I forgot to mention the one thing when she says Jesus never claims to be divine. I say this in several other podcasts, so I'm not going to say much here. Jesus does things and says things that only God would say and do. That's why he was crucified. Jesus forgives sins. When the Pharisees say, who's this guy thinks he is, only God can forgive sins. They understood it. They understood. When Jesus says to demonstrate that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, I say to you, pick up your mat and go home. He's doing things and speaking as if he is God. When he says the Son of Man will come back to judge. When he says the Son of Man will come with his angels. And on it goes. When he creates, when he gives commandments, when he acts as judge. If I'm a first century Jew, this is exactly what you do if you wanted to be seen in God's identity, as Richard Bauckham would say it. So no, Jesus does not walk around and say, I am God, because that would assume he's God the Father. He would do and say things that would cryptically, at sometimes, other times quite explicitly, demonstrate he's claiming divine prerogative. That's why he was crucified.
Now I ask you, do you follow the Holy Bible, or do you believe man-made doctrine? Think carefully and do your research before you answer that. In the meantime, here's what Jesus Christ has to say about it.
I can't. On the screen, she quotes from Matthew 15:9. She's trying to use Jesus to speak against people who follow Trinitarian development, I guess. I'm not sure. Oh my goodness, I can't believe. Okay, in Matthew 15, the Pharisees come and say, why in the world don't your disciples wash their hands? Why don't they do that? They disobey the tradition of the elders. The tradition of the elders, a little footnote, is oral. It's halakha haggadah. It's oral tradition that's passed around the law by Jewish experts in an attempt to interpret the law and therefore obey it perfectly. That's their goal. And he's saying, your disciples don't follow the tradition, the oral tradition of the elders of how to interpret the Old Testament Torah well. Jesus says in verse 3, and why do you disobey the commandment of God because of your tradition? For God said, honor your father and mother, and whoever insults his father and mother must be put to death. But you say, if someone tells his father and mother, whatever help you would have received from me is given to God, he does not need to honor his father. You have nullified the word of God on account of your tradition. Now, what's going on there is they're saying some of the Pharisees, some of the legal experts made up a tradition that if you say some of my savings is for God, I don't have to give it to my parents. I don't have to help them. It's set aside. It's like fine china. And so I don't have to help honor my father and mother when they get their retirement. He's saying, but when you do that, your tradition trumps what the scriptures say. And he says in verse 7, hypocrites, Isaiah prophesied correctly about you when he said, quote, this from Isaiah 29:13. He says, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. They worship me in vain, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. So this has nothing to do with the Trinity. This has nothing to do with whether or not human minds can come up with Trinitarian articulations. Nothing to do with it. If there were biblical commandments that said, do not try to articulate a Trinitarian theology, and then they did it, then this verse would be quoted in authority. That's exactly right. There are no such biblical verses at all. So that verse is irrelevant. The fact that she'd use it as evidence with fancy music demonstrates she just doesn't know how to read the Bible well. This is so unfortunate. It's so sad. And she's almost done.
And finally, the number one way to maintain your Christianity, don't read the Bible. Now, I'm not talking about a few verses here and there or the passage that the preacher gives you during the sermon. What I'm talking about is reading the Bible from beginning to end, starting at Genesis and ending with Revelation. Because if you do, you will find that the Old Testament is one big horror story, and God shows a lot of human despicable traits. But wait, I know Christians like to ignore the entire Old Testament, so definitely don't read the accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and compare the four Gospels to each other concerning the life and resurrection of Jesus Christ. You will find no less than 30 contradictions and inconsistencies between the four Gospels. And you do know that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not eyewitness accounts, nor were they actually written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Right? You know that, right?
I guess her sarcasm would be kind of funny if it weren't so profoundly ignorant. Did she know, you know this, right? You know this, right? That there are tens of thousands of biblical specialists around the world who have studied the Old New Testaments and all the original languages and spent an entire lifetime critiquing and criticizing, and yet are Christians? You know that, right? You know that Christians actually have read the Bible from top to bottom. You know that, right? You know that it's possible to read the Old New Testament and there are absolute, justified, wonderful interpretations for which there are no problems at all. You know that, right? You know that the contradictions that you think are in the Bible aren't contradictions, almost all that I've never seen one so far, because you have, for a contradiction to exist, and I'm not here trying to defend the Bible and say there are no contradictions. I'm just being logically consistent. For something to be a contradiction, it has to be mutually exclusive. It has to say Jesus was in Jerusalem and not in Galilee or something like that, and yet he was there at two places at the same time. Or on Monday he was here and Monday at the exact time in Jerusalem and Monday at the exact time he was in Galilee. And then you have to say, well, someone's wrong. That's not what you find. So for something to be a contradiction, you got to make sure it is contradictory. And even if there are contradictions, why can't a person remain a Christian? I don't need the Gospels not to be contradictory. In order for the teachings, the life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus to be true. There could be 500 contradictions, but if I have good, sound historical reason to believe that Jesus existed, taught about the kingdom of God and who he was, died on the cross and was resurrected from the dead, that's enough. You know that, right? You know that's enough, right? And you need evidence. You need evidence to demonstrate that the Gospels are not written by the people who are attributed by those names. You need evidence for that. You can go to Bart Ehrman all you want, that's fine, but you need to read other people besides Bart Ehrman to make your case. Bart Ehrman is not scholarship. Bart Ehrman is one author. You need to read the scholars and then make an argument, a professional argument in some kind of scholarly journal, or at least present your case in a better way than just saying, you know that, right? And even if they were not written by those authors, who gives a rip? Who gives a rip if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John didn't write those Gospels? What matters is if the oral tradition can be trusted behind the narrative. It is irrelevant if we don't know who the authors are. And in fact, we are not certain because they're anonymous documents. The documents themselves don't give us a name. What difference does that make? You know that's irrelevant, right? You know it doesn't matter if we don't know who the author is, right? What matters is whether or not it accurately represents what occurred. And there are really good reasons for believing that. Go read good books on it. Go read Richard Bauckham, The Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Go listen to my podcast. Go read my book. Read all kinds of books. If you want more books, I'll be happy to recommend them. There are enormous, really good reasons by critical scholars who have read the Bible frontward and backward, and they're not scared of it at all. I can't believe the naivete to say this stuff that's so condescending. Go read it, go study it, and then come back and complain about it.
Look, these are just tips from me to you that I wanted to share because I used to be a Christian too. I'm warning you not to do these things because it's risky. It's a hazard to your beliefs. But then again, as long as you're willing to suspend reason and logic and justify everything based on faith alone, you have nothing to worry about. You can do all of the things I mentioned in this video and still be able to keep your Christianity intact. Isn't that a wonderful thing? All you need is faith.
It's this last condescending, sarcastic stuff. It's the saddest. It's so sad that she thought she used to be a Christian, now she's not. Because these are profoundly stupid reasons to leave the faith. I can't believe it. I can't believe anybody. I don't know what happens. I really mean I can't believe it. I'm incredulous. I'm so sad about this. I feel sorry for her. Why in the world would you abandon? How could you do that? Being a Christian doesn't mean I know some facts or I've got some confusion. Being a Christian means you've met the resurrected Jesus, or at least his spirit, and he's changed your life. So what she's saying is, this is what she mean ideally. What meaning ideally would be, I met the risen Jesus, I repented of my sins, he changed my life, and then one day I changed my mind and realized I was delusional. Every single thing I experienced was completely wrong, and I reject he no longer exists. That's a big deal. That's like saying my wife no longer exists. I no longer believe I was married, or my friend growing up. There was a time I had in my memory that I did things and I went swimming during the summer at Brian McInnes's house, but now he no longer exists. I rescind my belief in all my experiences. That's a big deal. And I can't believe Old Testament narratives or the Noah account or some similarities in ancient cultures means Christianity is not true. So I'm begging you, if you're a Christian, please don't listen to this pablum. Please don't listen to this nonsense and be swayed by this. I'm so adamant and worked up in this podcast not to be mean. I'm not at all trying to be mean. If I came across that way, I apologize. This works me up because I'm mad that evil uses this nonsense to deconvert people. This is horrible. It's horrible that she left the faith if she really had one. This is dumb. And that condescending, sarcastic nonsense about if you don't, all you have is faith, you don't have reason and logic. And everything she said is nonsense. So I encourage you, don't listen to this nonsense, not because I'm scared of them. I'm scared that if you don't have the tools and you think this stuff is good just because they sound confident, I'm nervous for you. Please don't listen to them. You're not ready for it. Look on YouTube for Ben Witherington III, Richard Bauckham, Richard Burridge, Larry Hurtado. If you want some philosophers, go to J.P. Moreland, William Lane Craig. If you want biblicists, go to N.T. Wright. Go to John Walton. Listen to scholars. Don't listen to people who don't have a clue what they're talking about. Listen to scholars. If you're not going to read, at least listen to the right ones. So that's it. I'm not trying to be hateful, but this stuff is nonsense and it frustrates the snot out of me. And I don't know everything and whatever. All I'm trying to give is a quick response to these things and tell you that nothing she has said is in the least bit. It's not 0.1% compelling. I have thought through all of this stuff, and guess what? I remain a Christian. God bless you. See you next time.
Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I really do hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you'll listen more. If you want more, go to davidpendergrass.com. There are tabs at the top that let you have access to all the podcasts I've recorded, to sermons I've done, books I've written. They're all there at davidpendergrass.com. You can also check me out on Facebook, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom, and also look at my Twitter feed at glimpse the kingdom or at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass. There's tons of ways reached out. I hope you will. Send me your questions, send me your comments. If you'd like to support the ministries of Glimpse of the Kingdom, you can also find ways to give online on davidpendergrass.com. If you'd like for me to come and do some consulting, check out my website, davidpendergrassconsulting.com, and I'll be happy to come out and speak to your organization and help and train any way I can. God bless you. See you online.